The Millionaire CEO sat alone in a crowded restaurant, lost in numbers and noise, until two little girls with identical blue eyes and a bucket of flowers stopped at his table and unknowingly unraveled his entire past. Nicholas Harrison sat alone at the corner table of an upscale Manhattan restaurant, his tailored navy suit still perfect despite the tension etched into his shoulders. The untouched espresso in front of him had long since gone cold, but he didn't notice. His mind was spinning with numbers, failed negotiations, and the gnawing sense that even after everything he had built, his empire, his reputation, his wealth, something essential was missing. The room buzzed quietly with conversation and clinking glassware, but he heard none of it. He was so far inside his head that when a soft voice interrupted him, it felt like a foreign sound. "Would you like to buy a flower, sir?" He blinked, slightly startled, and looked down to see two small girls standing at the edge of his table. They couldn't have been older than 6, identical except for the ribbons in their hair, one wore pink, the other blue. Their cheeks were flushed from the cold outside, their clothes a little too thin for the winter air. One of them held out a plastic bucket with a few wilted roses inside, her hand trembling slightly from either nerves or chill. Nicholas frowned, his first instinct irritation. Children weren't supposed to be working, especially not this late. He asked, not unkindly but sharply, "Where are your parents? Why are you out here selling flowers?" The girl with the pink ribbon spoke first. "Our mom is in the hospital. We're trying to help her." Her voice was clear, direct, and painfully sincere. The other girl nodded beside her, gripping the edge of the bucket tighter. For a moment, Nicholas just stared at them. The automatic part of his brain wanted to dismiss them, to drop $100 bill on the table and send them away so he could return to his carefully constructed isolation. But then he looked closer. They had the same eyes as him. It wasn't just the blue, it was the exact same shade, icy and startling, eyes that didn't belong to children struggling to survive. And their features, softened by youth, of course, but there was a familiar curve in their chins, the same arch in their brows. His heart stuttered, just for a second, and he couldn't place why. He reached for his wallet and bought every flower they had. They smiled shyly, whispered "thank you," and turned to go, but something in him snapped. "Wait," he said, standing up, ignoring the dull ache in his lower back. "What's your mother's name?" The girls hesitated. Then the one with the blue ribbon said, "Sarah. Sarah Miller." The world tilted on its axis. That name hadn't passed his ears in 6 years. Sarah Miller. The one woman he had loved and lost, who had disappeared from his life without a word or a trace. His stomach twisted in a way he hadn't felt in a decade. He quickly gathered his coat, nearly forgot his phone on the table, and rushed out after them. "Where is she?" he asked, breath visible in the cold air. They told him the name of the hospital, not far from the restaurant. Without thinking, he called his driver and ordered him to reroute immediately. As the car pulled away, Nicholas stared at his own reflection in the window, those same blue eyes staring back, and for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about meetings or mergers. He was thinking about a woman he hadn't seen in over half a decade, and 2 little girls who looked just like him. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and something deeper, quiet suffering, tired hope, and sterile uncertainty. Nicholas walked through the automatic doors with his heart hammering against his ribs, a sharp contrast to the practiced calm he usually carried into boardrooms. He barely acknowledged the receptionist as he asked for Sarah Miller's room, his voice clipped and urgent. The name felt strange on his tongue, like something sacred that had been locked away too long. The woman behind the counter checked the system and gave him a room number, adding that visiting hours were nearly over. He thanked her absently and moved quickly down the hall, every step echoing louder in his ears than it should have. He reached the door and paused, his hand hovering over the handle. For a moment, he considered turning back. What was he even doing here? Barging into the life of someone who clearly hadn't wanted him in it? But the image of the girl standing beside his table flashed through his mind again, those eyes, those faces, and something deeper than logic took hold. He pushed the door open quietly. The room was dim, the overhead lights turned off and only a small lamp casting a warm glow. Sarah lay in the hospital bed, her face turned toward the window. Her hair was longer than he remembered, but paler now, pulled back into a messy braid that had loosened around her face. She looked thinner, fragile in a way he had never seen before, as if the years had carved lines into her not from age, but from carrying too much on her own. Yet even in this weakened state, she radiated the quiet strength he remembered. Her eyes opened slowly, and when they focused on him, she blinked once, then again, disbelief spreading across her face like a storm cloud. "Nicholas," she said, and even her voice, hoarse, low, hit him like a punch to the chest. He stepped inside, gently closing the door behind him. "Hi, Sarah," he said, unsure what else to offer. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He could see her trying to sit up straighter, though the effort clearly caused her pain. He moved instinctively toward her but stopped when she held up a hand. "What are you doing here?" Her voice carried more confusion than anger, but there was a guardedness to it that made him ache. "I saw them," he said quietly. "Two girls. Selling flowers outside a restaurant." Sarah closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, they were wet with something between guilt and resignation. "I told them not to go that far," she whispered. "They said your name," Nicholas continued, trying to keep his voice steady. "Sarah Miller. And then I saw them. Their faces. Their eyes." He let the sentence trail off, not because he didn't know what to say, but because the emotion behind it was too much to contain in words. Sarah looked away, staring at the 4-line in her arm. "I didn't want you to find out like this." "Then how was I supposed to find out?" he asked, a little sharper than he meant to. "Or was I never supposed to know at all?" Silence thickened the room. Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and stared down at them. "When I found out I was pregnant, you were already on a different path. You were flying to Tokyo the next week. You had just closed that billion-dollar development deal. You barely slept, Nicholas. You were obsessed with making something big of yourself." He didn't deny it. She wasn't wrong. "I thought about telling you," she went on, her voice softer now. "But I kept imagining what would happen. You'd come back out of obligation. You'd resent me. You'd resent them. And I couldn't let them grow up feeling like someone's burden." Nicholas felt the words slice through him. He wanted to defend himself, to tell her that she had no right to decide for him, that he would have made it work, but part of him knew that back then, 6 years ago, he might have proved her fears right. "You should have given me the choice," he said, but his voice lacked anger now. It was just full of ache. She finally looked back at him, and in her expression he saw the weight of all the years she had carried alone. "I was wrong. I know that now," she said. "But I did what I thought was best." He sat in the chair beside her bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Are they mine?" he asked, even though he already knew. Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes. Both of them." Something in him unraveled. The certainty, the logic, the emotional armor he had built so carefully over the years, none of it mattered now. "I want to be part of their lives," he said, and he meant it with a clarity that surprised even himself. "But I need to know for sure. I'm going to do a DNA test. Not because I doubt you. I just need. I need to see it in writing." Sarah didn't argue. She simply nodded again. "Okay." Nicholas stood, suddenly unable to stay still. "I'll take care of the costs for your treatment. Whatever you need." "I didn't tell you so you'd rescue me," she said quickly, her voice regaining strength. "This isn't about money." "I know," he replied. "It's about them. And it's about not losing another day." He looked at her for a moment longer, then left the room quietly, the sound of his footsteps fading into the long, sterile hallway. For the first time in his life, Nicholas Harrison wasn't running toward profit or ambition. He was running toward the truth, toward two little girls with blue eyes and a mother who had done the impossible without him. And now, finally, he would not look away. The results came faster than Nicholas expected. His connections in the medical world had quietly expedited the DNA test, and now he sat alone in his apartment, a single sheet of paper resting on the counter in front of him like it held the power to shatter or complete him. He hadn't opened it yet. His hand hovered just above the page, and despite being a man used to making billion-dollar decisions without flinching, he felt paralyzed by a quiet kind of fear. Because deep down, he already knew what it would say. The mirror had told him. The girls' voices had told him. Sarah's face when he walked into that hospital room had told him. But seeing it on paper would make it real in a way nothing else could. When he finally unfolded the document, his eyes scanned the text without hesitation. The words jumped out at him in stark clarity. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Lily and Chloe were his daughters. Flesh and blood. Every carefully constructed wall around his heart seemed to collapse in silence. There were no tears, only an ache that went deeper than regret. It was the ache of years lost, of lullabies unsung, of birthdays missed and scraped knees he hadn't been there to soothe. He didn't waste time. The next morning, he returned to the hospital. The girls were there in the waiting room with a nurse, coloring quietly on a small table covered with markers and torn sheets. They looked up when he walked in, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Lily stood, brushing off her little dress like she was preparing for something important. She stared at him with the kind of seriousness only a child could have and asked, "Are you really our daddy?" Her voice didn't tremble. She asked like she needed the truth and wouldn't accept anything less. Chloe stood beside her, holding her hand, her bright blue eyes wide and cautious. Nicholas knelt in front of them, his voice catching in his throat for just a second before he found it. "Yes," he said softly. "I am." The girls stared at him for a moment longer, and then, in perfect unison, they stepped forward and wrapped their arms around his neck. The hug was clumsy and tight and everything. He closed his eyes and let himself feel it. The warmth of their small bodies, the way Chloe's fingers curled into his jacket, the way Lily's head pressed against his shoulder. He had never known a feeling like this. It was terrifying and overwhelming and indescribably right. They sat together for nearly an hour. He listened to them talk about their favorite cartoons, the names of their stuffed animals, and how the hospital food was gross. Chloe offered him one of her drawings, a crooked heart with the words, "For Mommy," scrawled in shaky letters across it. Lily told him he had to learn how to braid because she and Chloe hated when the nurse did their hair too tight. Nicholas promised he would learn. He meant it. Later, he spoke with Sarah. She looked stronger than she had a few days earlier, though still pale. When he told her the test confirmed what she already knew, she simply nodded. She hadn't needed proof, but she respected that he had. "They love you already," she said, not smiling, but not cold either. "They don't understand everything yet, but they know you're important." Nicholas didn't respond right away. He was staring at a photo taped to the wall beside Sarah's bed, a picture the girls had drawn of a house with 4 stick figures. One of them had dark brown hair and a tie. "I want to be here," he said finally. "Not for a few days. Not for appearances. I want to be their father in every way. I don't care how messy that gets. I missed enough already." Sarah's expression softened. "Then don't make promises you can't keep." "I won't," he said. "Not this time." When he left the hospital that day, Nicholas felt something new threading through his veins, not adrenaline, not control, not ambition. It was something quieter, stronger. It was the resolve of a man who had finally found what he hadn't even known he was missing. And he knew without question that whatever came next, whatever rebuilding had to happen, he would not walk away from this chance. Not again. Nicholas spent the following days adjusting to a rhythm of life that no meeting, spreadsheet, or strategy session could have prepared him for. Each morning began with a visit to the hospital, not out of obligation but because it had become the only place he truly wanted to be. Sarah's condition was gradually improving, though she still tired easily and sometimes had difficulty sitting up for more than a few minutes. The nurses grew accustomed to seeing Nicholas in the hallway, carrying juice boxes and coloring books, learning the small rituals of fatherhood one moment at a time. What amazed him most was how quickly Lily and Chloe had made room for him in their world. They didn't ask for explanations about why he hadn't been there before, and they didn't demand reassurances about whether he would stay. They simply accepted his presence with an unspoken trust that humbled him every time they reached for his hand or called his name across the room. One afternoon, as snow began to fall outside the hospital windows, Nicholas sat with the girls in the family room down the hall from Sarah's ward. Chloe had curled up on his lap and was busy showing him how to fold paper into crooked stars, while Lily sat across from them drawing a lopsided house with 4 stick figures inside. Nicholas watched her carefully add hair to each one, then label them with short names in large, uneven letters. The smallest one was marked Me, another, Chloe, the third Mommy, and finally, the tallest figure with brown hair was marked Daddy. When she held the picture up for him to see, pride lighting up her entire face, something shifted inside him so deeply he could hardly breathe. That night, after the girls were asleep and the room had gone quiet except for the soft hum of machines, Nicholas sat beside Sarah's bed while she dozed in and out of light sleep. She looked fragile under the thin hospital blanket, but there was still strength in her jaw, in the way her fingers twitched as if she were holding on to something invisible even as she rested. When she stirred and opened her eyes, she found him still there, leaning back in the chair, hands clasped in his lap. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to fill the space with explanations or apologies. The silence had become familiar, not uncomfortable. Eventually, Sarah said, "They've never had this before. A father, I mean. Just me, and sometimes that wasn't enough." Nicholas looked at her and said quietly, "I think you've done more than enough." She shook her head. "No. I've kept them safe and loved, but they've always looked at other families like they were watching something they didn't quite understand. Now they look at you like something clicked. Like a missing piece just fell into place." He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded slowly. "I want to be that piece. I don't expect it to be simple. I know I can't undo the years we lost." "They don't expect you to," Sarah said. "They just want to know you're real. And that you'll still be there tomorrow." Nicholas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the weariness of the week settling into his bones. "I will be. I don't want to be anywhere else." Sarah smiled faintly, the corners of her lips turning up just enough to soften her face. "You've changed." "I had to," he replied. "They deserve someone better than who I was." When she fell back asleep, Nicholas didn't leave. He sat in the dim light of the hospital room, watching the snow swirl past the window, thinking about everything he hadn't known he'd missed. He thought about birthday candles, scraped knees, bedtime stories, and little hands reaching up for his. He thought about how close he'd come to never knowing any of it. In that quiet moment, he made a decision. Not a fleeting one born of guilt or fear, but a deep, unshakable commitment. He would be there, not just as a visitor or a helper, but as a father in every sense of the word. He had spent years mastering power and control, only to realize that the truest strength came not from dominating the world, but from being willing to love without condition. And that's exactly what he intended to do. After a week of steady improvement, Sarah was released from the hospital, and Nicholas found himself suddenly standing at the edge of a reality he hadn't fully prepared for. He had spent days in the safe, structured in-between of hospital routines, visits, drawings, nurse check-ins, but now, with Sarah back in her apartment and the girls home full-time, everything shifted. The stakes felt higher, the quiet more fragile, the demands more personal. Sarah's apartment was small and neat, full of signs of love but also of struggle, an aging couch patched with fabric, children's artwork covering the walls, and stacks of bills in the kitchen corner that she quickly tucked away when he entered. She had always been proud. That hadn't changed. Nicholas arrived the morning after her release with groceries he'd never have purchased himself just months ago, cereal with cartoon animals on the box, juice boxes, pasta shaped like animals. He wasn't sure if it was enough, but it was something. The girls greeted him with sleepy smiles, their hair wild from sleep, and he helped them pour milk into bowls while Sarah rested in her room. Chloe insisted on sitting in his lap during breakfast, and Lily told him all about a dream she had where he built them a pink house with a slide instead of stairs. He nodded seriously and said, "We'll look into that," and both girls squealed with laughter. It was absurd and perfect. When Sarah emerged, moving slowly and with obvious effort, Nicholas offered to take the girls out for a few hours to let her rest. At first, she hesitated. He could see it in her eyes, that old instinct to protect and control everything because she'd had no other choice. But she nodded, and before long, he was loading Lily and Chloe into his car, adjusting their seatbelts and asking if they liked cartoons or music better. They chose both. The park was mostly empty that morning, the air crisp but not too cold, and Nicholas walked behind them as they raced ahead, their tiny sneakers kicking up leaves. He felt strangely exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't expected. He wasn't in a boardroom or in front of investors. He was just a man trailing after two little girls who called him daddy now, and the weight of that word followed him with every step. At one point, Lily fell and scraped her knee, and the sound of her cry cut through him more sharply than any financial loss ever had. He rushed forward, heart pounding, and picked her up with a gentleness he hadn't known lived in his hands. She buried her face in his chest and sobbed while Chloe stood beside them, fiercely holding her sister's hand. Nicholas wiped away tears, kissed the top of her head, and whispered over and over, "You're okay, I've got you," until she finally quieted. That moment changed something in him. It was no longer about proving he could be their father. It was about being someone they could fall into without hesitation, someone whose arms meant safety. Later, back at the apartment, he made dinner, something simple and slightly overcooked, but the girls cheered like it was a feast. Sarah sat at the kitchen table watching, her eyes softer now, her walls slowly coming down. After the girls were asleep, Nicholas lingered in the living room. He felt like he didn't want to leave, like going back to his cold, minimalist condo would be like stepping into a life that no longer fit him. Sarah sat beside him on the couch, wrapping a blanket over her lap, and they talked in quiet voices about the girls, about the past, about the messiness of everything. She told him how lonely it had been, how many nights she'd stayed up wondering if she'd made the right choice in hiding the truth, and he told her that he wasn't angry anymore. Sad, yes. But not angry. He understood now. When he finally stood to go, Sarah surprised him. She reached out and touched his arm lightly, her fingers trembling just a little. "You're doing okay," she said. "They're happy." Nicholas looked at her, the tired honesty in her eyes, and felt something inside him settle. "I want this," he said. "All of it. I know I wasn't there before, but I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." She didn't say anything, but she nodded, and in that nod was the beginning of something new, something built not on the past, but on the promise of what could still be. As Nicholas walked out into the cool night air, he realized that for the first time in years, he felt full. Not with success or control or recognition, but with something real. Something worth every sacrifice he hadn't known he would ever be willing to make. Winter had fully taken hold of the city, dressing the streets in a thin layer of frost and turning the breath of passers-by into brief clouds in the air. Nicholas found himself adjusting to a rhythm that was both unfamiliar and comforting. His days, once strictly segmented into meetings, deadlines, and jet-setting across continents, were now structured by simpler things: school drop-offs, bedtime stories, lunch boxes with handwritten notes inside. He was still CEO, still answering emails and reviewing contracts, but the sharp edge of his ambition had softened. His attention was no longer divided by default. It had simply shifted. There was no confusion in his mind now about what mattered more. Every morning began the same way. He would arrive at Sarah's apartment just after 7, always with something warm, bagels, pancakes, or oatmeal with bananas the way Chloe liked it. The girls would greet him in mismatched pajamas, hair sticking up in odd directions, and he'd help them get dressed while Sarah drank her tea slowly at the kitchen table, still regaining strength but already more alive than he remembered her being in those sterile hospital rooms. He noticed things: how Lily liked her socks pulled up just below the knee, how Chloe always put her shoes on the wrong feet first, how Sarah watched them both with a mother's pride that she no longer tried to hide from him. These details grounded him in ways he didn't expect. One afternoon, while Sarah was resting and the girls were napping, Nicholas stood in the quiet apartment and looked around. Toys were scattered across the rug. A crayon drawing hung crookedly on the fridge. The air smelled faintly of apple-scented soap and lavender laundry detergent. He realized with startling clarity that this was the first space in years that actually felt like home. Not his penthouse with sleek furniture and museum-like silence, but this small, slightly messy place filled with noise and breath and warmth. Later that evening, the four of them sat together on the floor building a puzzle. It was a scene of a colorful farm with too many sky pieces and missing corners, but the girls didn't care. Nicholas found himself laughing, real laughter, the kind that made his ribs hurt and tears prick at his eyes. When Chloe asked if he had ever done puzzles when he was little, he shook his head and said he couldn't remember. She looked at him very seriously and said, "Well, you can remember now. With us." That moment stayed with him long after the puzzle was packed away. The next morning, Sarah handed him a stack of envelopes. He raised an eyebrow, confused, and she simply said, "Bills. Things I haven't had the energy to open." There was no shame in her voice, no bitterness. Just honesty. Nicholas took them without a word and went through each one that evening, making calls, setting up payments, clearing debts she had carried alone for years. It wasn't about money. It was about stepping fully into the space she had guarded alone for too long and saying, without needing to say it, that she wasn't alone anymore. That night, Sarah stood in the kitchen while he loaded the dishwasher. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching him with an unreadable expression. After a moment, she said, "You're good with them. I didn't expect that." He paused, closing the dishwasher door with a quiet click. "Neither did I," he admitted. She smiled then, the kind of small, private smile that said she was still figuring out what to make of all this. "They love you, you know," she said softly. "They don't understand the past, but they understand who you are to them now." Nicholas looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper in his eyes. "I want them to grow up knowing they're never alone. I want them to know that someone will always show up, no matter what." Sarah walked over to him and placed her hand gently on his chest, just over his heart. "Then you're already doing it." In the stillness that followed, Nicholas realized he had finally arrived at something he had chased his entire adult life. It wasn't a promotion or a title or a number in a bank account. It was this: being seen, being needed, being part of something unshakably real. And he wasn't going to let it go. December rolled in quietly, and with it came the buzz of Christmas lights strung over city streets, paper snowflakes taped to apartment windows, and the constant sound of carols drifting from storefronts. For Nicholas, this season had always been just another quarter to close, an opportunity for end-of-year financial wins, corporate parties filled with shallow laughter, and obligatory charity galas. But this year, everything felt different. His days were now filled with the kind of anticipation he hadn't experienced since childhood, except this time, it wasn't about presents under a tree. It was about making memories, creating something lasting for Lily and Chloe that would prove, again and again, he was here to stay. He had never decorated a Christmas tree in his life, but when Sarah mentioned, half joking, that they would be using their tiny artificial tree again this year, Nicholas showed up the next morning with a real pine tree strapped to the roof of his car and a trunk full of ornaments, garlands, and a star that lit up. The girls screamed when they saw it, running circles around the living room, while Sarah stood in the doorway, one hand over her mouth, torn between laughing and crying. He helped them set it up, guiding their small hands as they hung glittering baubles too close together, letting them place 3 different stars on the top before finally agreeing which one stayed. It was chaos and glitter and joy. Sarah was quieter that week. She watched him often, studying the way he moved through their home, how naturally the girls now reached for him, how quickly he had folded himself into the rhythm of their lives. One night, after the girls had gone to sleep, she asked him to take a walk. The cold air bit at their faces as they walked side by side down the block, the glow of streetlights painting their shadows onto the sidewalk. She didn't speak for a long time, and Nicholas let the silence be, waiting without pressure, his hands tucked deep in his coat pockets. Finally, she said, "I keep waiting for it to fall apart. For you to wake up one day and remember who you were before this. That you were never meant to stay." Her voice wasn't accusing, just tired, honest, fragile. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "I did remember who I was. And that's why I'm here. Because that man, he had everything but lived like nothing mattered. I didn't know what I was missing until I saw their faces. Until I saw you again." Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her posture changed. She wasn't bracing anymore. She was listening, not just to his words but to what had shifted in him over these weeks. "They need you," she said. "But don't forget, I do too. Just not in the way I used to." Nicholas nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she meant. They weren't returning to what they once had. This was something new. It would take time. It would require patience neither of them had needed before. But it was worth it. On Christmas Eve, Nicholas surprised them with a small gathering. Nothing extravagant, just a warm dinner, stockings he had helped the girls hang, and a few close friends of Sarah's who had helped her through the hardest years. He stood beside her in the kitchen as the girls tore into their gifts, the sound of paper ripping and laughter echoing through the apartment. He looked at Sarah, who leaned lightly against him, and for a moment, it felt like they had always been this way. Like the years apart had simply paused what had always been meant to continue. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the girls were tucked in bed clutching their new toys, Nicholas and Sarah sat in the soft glow of the Christmas tree. Neither of them said much. They didn't need to. The peace that filled the room was louder than any conversation. When he reached over and took her hand in his, she didn't pull away. Instead, she rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "You kept your promise." And he had. For the first time in his life, he had shown up not to fix something, not to impress, not to win, but simply to stay. Spring came slowly that year, washing away the gray of winter with soft winds and longer days. By April, the city had thawed, and tulips were blooming in sidewalk planters, their bright colors spilling over like confetti. In the apartment Sarah once held together with quiet strength and cautious hope, life had begun to look different. The walls were still covered in crayon drawings, but now there were framed photos too, pictures of Lily and Chloe on Nicholas's shoulders at the zoo, Sarah smiling from the hospital bed while the girls piled beside her, and even one that Nicholas had taken himself of all 4 of them baking cookies, flour dusted across every surface and smile. Nicholas had made good on every promise, not through grand declarations but through the quiet persistence of showing up. He helped with science projects, learned how to braid hair, badly, and spent Sunday mornings building blanket forts in the living room. He still ran his company, still wore suits and signed contracts, but something fundamental had shifted in how he moved through the world. He no longer measured success by quarterly growth or market expansions but by how many bedtime stories he read, how often the girls laughed so hard they fell over, and whether Sarah let her guard down just a little more than the day before. One afternoon, Sarah invited him to walk with her to the park. It wasn't far, just a few blocks away, but it was one of those perfect spring days when the air smelled like new beginnings. The girls raced ahead, chasing each other with plastic pinwheels, while Nicholas and Sarah strolled behind them. There was something easy between them now, something earned. She told him she was considering going back to work part-time once the girls started school full days in the fall, and he encouraged her, offering to rearrange his schedule so he could do pickups or drop-offs. It was casual, seamless, like they had already become a team in all the small, meaningful ways that mattered most. At the playground, Nicholas pushed Chloe on the swings while Lily climbed across the monkey bars and shouted for him to watch. Sarah sat on the bench nearby, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes warm and calm. She hadn't said it yet, not out loud, but he could feel it in her gaze, in the way she no longer flinched when he made plans involving them months down the line. She believed in him now, not just as the man he had become but as the father he had chosen to be. That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep with arms flung across their pillows and storybooks open on their chests, Sarah and Nicholas sat on the fire escape, a blanket around their shoulders and mugs of tea warming their hands. They talked about the girls, about summer plans, about nothing and everything. The city stretched around them, alive and distant, but their world had become something smaller and infinitely more important. At one point, Sarah turned to him, her voice low but clear, and said, "I didn't think we'd get here. I thought too much had happened. That you wouldn't want this, or worse, that you'd want it for the wrong reasons." Nicholas didn't rush to answer. He looked out over the quiet street, the glow of the street lamp catching the gold in her hair. "I wanted success for so long because I thought it would fix what was empty inside me," he said. "But it never did. Then I met them, and it wasn't just that I wanted to be in their lives. I needed to be. They showed me the version of myself I was always meant to be, and I don't want to be anyone else now." Sarah reached out and touched his hand, and there was no hesitation in it. He turned his palm up and laced their fingers together. There was no big speech, no dramatic declaration. Just two people, broken in their own ways, choosing each other again, not because they had to, but because they knew the cost of not doing so. Months later, in a small garden behind their new home, Lily and Chloe ran barefoot through the grass while Nicholas assembled a crooked swing set, and Sarah watched with her feet up and a lemonade in hand. It wasn't a picture-perfect life. There were still late nights and tantrums, dishes that piled up, and moments of doubt. But there was also laughter and trust, and more love than Nicholas ever thought he'd be capable of giving or receiving. He had spent years building skyscrapers, collecting accolades, becoming someone people admired from a distance. But none of it compared to the sound of his daughters calling him daddy or the way Sarah looked at him when she knew he wasn't going anywhere. That was the legacy he wanted now, not glass towers, but a home with lights in the windows and voices in the hallway. Not power, but presence. Not perfection, but family. This story ends where it truly begins, with a man who once measured his worth by deals and deadlines learning that real value lies in presence, not power. What moved me most about Nicholas's journey wasn't the dramatic reveal or even the emotional reunion, but the quiet, persistent transformation that happened through everyday moments, spilled juice, bedtime routines, scraped knees. His redemption didn't come from grand gestures, but from showing up, over and over, until love became habit and family became home. It's a reminder that healing is possible even after long silence, and that sometimes the life we were meant for is waiting exactly where we never thought to look.